Hello, this is Learning with Mark Warren, and today we're going to explain the ins and outs of how to use the Focusrite Control Software. Today we're going to make sense out of using the Focusrite Control Software with your Scarlett or Claret interface. So what is the Focusrite Control Software? The Focusrite Control Software allows you to create custom mixes for each of your audio interface outputs. On the first generation Scarlett interfaces starting with the 6i6 and above, it was called the Focusrite Scarlett Mix Control. It was very confusing and hard to understand. On the second generation Scarlett interfaces, as well as the Claret, it's now called the Focusrite Control. The easiest way to think about it is each output on the interface has its own individual mixer. So in my case, I have the 18i8 Generation 2, which is up to 18 inputs and 8 outputs. The outputs can be 4 stereo pairs or 8 individual mono outputs. So it's like I have 4 mixers for each of my 4 stereo pairs or 8 mixers for each of my 8 individual mono outputs. After you install your Focusrite driver and open up the Focusrite Control Software, one of the first things you're going to want to do is go to the device settings. In the device settings, you're going to set your sampling rate and your clock source. By default, most of us should be using internal. However, if you have an SPDIF device or an ADAT for additional inputs, you can use the clock source from one of those as well. I typically use 48 kHz for my sampling rate. The system shows the sync status is locked, and I'm using the internal clock source. Now you have additional configuration options for the first 4 inputs on your interface. So for example, I have analog 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now on the first 2 inputs, you can specify the device type. You can specify whether it's a line level device or an instrument level device. You also have the option to turn on pad. So for instance, if you have an instrument like a guitar or bass that has too hot of a signal coming in, you can turn the pad switch on, which will actually bring down the decibel level for that particular input. My particular devices don't have this issue, so I can just leave that off. You can also turn on the pad for instruments 3 and 4. Now you do have the option to also name your inputs. So for example, I have a guitar on my analog 1 input, I have bass on 2, condenser mic on 3, and a regular mic on 4. All you have to do to change the name is just click on it at the top and type what you would like. Now for the meat and potatoes, the output routing section. The way the Focusrite Control Software is set up is the outputs are on the left and the inputs are on the right. Now I'm using the 18i8 Generation 2, so I have a main output, so that's output 1 and 2. I have a headphone 1 output, that's a stereo pair. I have a headphone 2 output, that's also a stereo pair. And then the SPDIF outputs, which are also stereo pairs. So the way this works, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now you can change the stereo pairs to mono signals, so they're mono outputs as well, just by turning off the stereo button. And that will actually split this up to a single mono output, and then I have my mono output 2 as well. Since most of us use stereo outputs, you'll probably more than likely leave them set to stereo. Now I'm going to go through the main mix output. We'll talk about that first and how this works. And then we'll move on to some examples that you can use for the other outputs. Now on the main output 1 and 2, that's the 1 and 2 that's coming out the back of my 18i8. I've named it main out, and again, if you want to change the name of this, you can just click on this little area right below where it says monitor outputs 1 and 2. Now you can choose to have presets or custom mixes. So the way the presets work, for instance, if I only want to hear what the software or Windows Audio is doing, I can come under here, click Playback DAW, hit 1, 2. Now the only thing that I'm going to hear out of the main outputs out of the back of the speakers is either what's coming from my Windows system or what's coming out of the output of 1 and 2 from my DAW. So that's software playback. If I change this to 3 and 4, if I were in my DAW, I would hear what's coming out of the outputs 3 and 4 within my DAW to outputs 1 and 2. If I come down here to click on Windows, I don't hear anything at all. That's because Windows is set up to mainly output on outputs 1 and 2 and not 3 and 4 by default. Another thing you could do is come under Hardware Input and use the analog preset. So maybe I just want to hear the analog inputs of 1 and 2 out of my output. If I grab my guitar and I strum it, I have my guitar plugged into analog 1, I hear that out of my speaker output. It's kind of limiting using the preset, so most of us are probably going to set up our own custom mix. The custom mix is nothing more of what do you want to hear out of this main output. Every input that you want to hear has to go out of the main output here. So right now I only have my guitar, bass, condenser mic, and a dynamic mic plugged into my system. If I wanted to add more inputs, I can simply click on the plus button. This little pop-up will slide out. So I have currently turned on inputs 1, 2, 3, and 4. I can also turn on 5, 6, 7, 8. Now if I wanted them to be stereo pairs, I can just click on this right-hand side, and now they become stereo pairs. Most people typically use their inputs as mono inputs, but say you have a stereo keyboard, you can turn on 5 and 6 for that input and it will install as a stereo pair. But again, since I'm only using my first 4 inputs, I don't need to have the other ones showing. Now if I wanted to also hear the inputs from the SPDIF or ADAT, I can turn on these additional inputs as well. I don't have either of these plugged into my device, so we're not going to worry about them for now. Now software playback or your DAW playback is counted as an input also as well. So think about the routing this way. Your Windows or your computer audio has to be output, and it's being output into the Focusrite control through this mixer and then out of the output of the speakers. So it goes from Windows to into Focusrite control out of your speakers. And we can test this and easily understand how this works by clicking on the speaker icon here in Windows, clicking for our Windows test sound, and now I can hear what's going on in Windows. Now if I didn't want to hear Windows at all, I can mute this. Now when I play this, you'll still see the signal, the little bar come up for the signal showing that it's being output, but since this channel is muted, nothing's coming out of the output. So I'm going to unmute this, play our test sound again, and there we go. Now I do have a Q output, and I'll explain why that's there in just a little bit, but let's talk about some practical uses that you can use for the hardware input with your main output. So here's a main output mix setup example. You first want to determine, do you want to monitor the mix with no latency, or would you rather monitor in your DAW with latency? So let me first show you how to set this up to monitor your mix with no latency at all. So latency, again, is that delay of time that you hear from actually singing or striking a key on your keyboard or on your guitar before you actually hear it out of the speakers. So if you don't want to hear any latency at all, you can actually monitor these hardware inputs. Right now I have them muted, so I'm going to unmute them. Now I'm going to grab my guitar and just play something really quick. My guitar is plugged into analog 1, and when I strum the strings, you hear it out of my main output speakers. Now that signal coming out of the main output speakers, it's being sent to the speakers with no latency. So as soon as I strum the guitar, it goes straight through the audio system to the speakers, no latency at all. And this is good if you want to monitor a mix as it's being played with no delay at all. Now, let's say for instance you want to actually use an effect within your DAW. So say I wanted to put on some type of amp effect on my guitar as I'm playing it. Well, I don't want to hear the raw signal of the guitar, I want to hear the amp signal. So in this case, you may want to choose to use monitoring within your DAW. And in this case, I would recommend muting all of your mix channels within the Focusrite controls so you don't hear the signal twice. So I'm going to mute all of these and I'm going to open up my DAW and show you how that's set up. So I've got Ableton Live 10 Beta up here, and I'm going to go into Preferences and show you the audio settings here first. So on my input configuration, I have 1 and 2 for my guitar and bass. Those are mono inputs. I have 3 and 4 turned on for the condenser and dynamic mic. And then I also have inputs 9 and 10 for the SPDIF. Now, I'll talk more about the SPDIF in just a moment. So for the output configuration, I only have my stereo outputs of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Now remember how I said software playback works? Basically this output is going into the Windows system, then it comes into the Focusrite Control Mixer software, so that's the main output here for 1 and 2, and then goes out of the speaker. Back in Live, output 3 and 4 does the same thing. It goes out of Ableton to the Windows system. It gets input into the Focusrite Control as Q. This is output 3 and 4, and then out of the speakers. But right now I have that volume completely turned down on that one, or I can mute it as well. Now I'm going to show you quickly how to record audio within Ableton Live and use the DAW for monitoring versus using Focusrite Control. Now remember, we've muted all of our inputs within the Focusrite Control software. So if I actually strum my guitar, you see the signal level that there is a signal coming in, but nothing's coming output out of the speakers over here. So back in Ableton Live, now I'm going to turn the monitoring on to auto and arm the track so I can hear what's coming into Live from my audio input 1. So now I'm hearing that signal. I'm going to grab an amp effect and drop that onto this track. We'll grab Blues Drive and drag it onto the track. So you're hearing the signal directly output from the speakers. Now if I want to record that, I'm going to click the record button on our session clip and record the take. So now I'm doing all of the monitoring directly through Live. I have the monitoring source set to auto. Once I take off the arming for this track and I play my guitar, I don't hear anything coming out of the speakers anymore because it's going to automatically handle whether I hear the signal or not. However, if I play back the clip, you hear the clip as I played it into the system. So that is monitoring directly through the DAW instead of using the Focusrite Control software. Now, by monitoring directly through the DAW, I am actually getting some latency. So if I go back into Options and Preferences, back on Audio, you see I have an input latency of 6.29 milliseconds and an output latency of the same. So my overall latency is 12.6 milliseconds. And that's using a buffer size of 128 samples. For me, I don't really hear the delay, so that's perfectly fine for me. But for those who really need that low latency, you want to make sure you have your buffer size as low as you possibly can go to try to get the lowest latency possible. I know my system works perfectly fine with no cracks or crackles or anything like that at 128, so I just leave my buffer size for that, and this works fine for me. Now I'm going to show you using the Headphone 1 output for a different mix setup. So clicking on Headphone 1, you'll notice I have the same hardware inputs for Headphone 1 as I do for my main outputs. One of the things that happens with the Focusrite Control Software is any input you install is carried over to all of the outputs, but you can have a different setup on each one. So for example, if I were to add in 5, 6, 7, and 8 for my inputs on the headphone, and then click back over to the monitor outputs, it'll carry over here as well. However, if I come over here back to headphone 1, and let's say I mute these, and then I go back up to monitor output 2, these are not muted here. So again, I've got a custom configuration or a custom mix setup here for these, but a different one for those. But I don't use these inputs, so I'm just going to turn them back off. Now, I'm going to show you a setup that I use for my headphone jack 1, and that's setting up a DJ cue. Let's say you want to recreate a DJ setup. So your audience or your crowd, they're going to hear what's coming out of the speakers, and you want to be able to cue your mix so you know what song to play next. So I don't need the hardware inputs when I'm doing a DJ setup. So I have all of these muted within the Focusrite Control Software. I do want to hear my main mix out of the headphones. So whatever's going out of the DAW software playback output 1 and 2, I want to be able to hear that, but I don't want to hear it at full signal. I only want to hear some of the signal. So I'm going to turn the volume down on that main output just a little bit. I do want to hear whatever I'm cueing, so that's going on output 3, 4 from the DAW. So let's go back into Ableton Live and set that up. So I'm going to delete this track out, that little clip out, and I'm also going to delete these MIDI tracks. And I'm going to set this up just like I was getting ready to do a DJ set. So I'm going to drag these out a little bit. Let's go to rename this. And we're going to call this Deck 1. And we'll rename this one and call it Deck 2. I don't really need to worry about audio from, but what I'm going to do over here on the master section, cue out is going to go out of outputs 3 and 4. So 3 and 4 cue. And my master output is going to go out to output 1 and 2 from the main. I've got my 2 tracks added here. Now I'm going to grab in a couple of clips and put them on Deck 1 and Deck 2. But before I do that, I also need to set up my crossfader. So I've got A side, B side of the crossfader, and if you're not familiar with that, you can click on the X here within Ableton Live to bring up the crossfader option to turn that on. I want A over here, I want B over here. What I'm going to do is click this over to the A side. I'm going to go to, let's see here, my user library. I want Essential EDM. We'll grab wave loops, drum loops, and this one should work. Okay, so now I'm going to grab another loop and put that in on the other side. So we'll come over here to Bass, House, and Garage, and just the F minor chord synth. Now I do need to switch off solo over here because right now the buttons are acting as solo. I'm going to turn that off, so now it's set up as cue. So it shows a little picture of the headphones whenever it is set up as the cue. So when I click these headphones and turn them on, I can start playing this. Now this is actually what's being heard in my headphones right now. Granted, I can't really simulate that here on the thing, but I can show you that in the Focusrite Control Software. So this is the main signal coming out of main output. I'm going to mute that on this headphone channel. So that won't be heard at all. But what is being heard, as you can see on cue output over here, is 3/4 for the playback. So I'm going to bring that level up. I'd actually hear both the main mix plus what's coming out of the cue at the same time. If I come into Ableton and I stop this, you'll see cue is stopping that signal there. So this is all from my DJ cue setup. I'm still hearing the main mix in the headphones. I'm not hearing the cue at the time. If I turn this back on, now you start to see that in the cue output again at the same time. So when I do this, now I can drag this crossfader over and it starts to bring both of those in at the same time. And bring it back to the middle. Bring the beats back in. And there you go. That's a simple DJ setup using the Focusrite Control Software. Now you can do routing and do this all internally within the software, but it kind of makes it easier having it in the Focusrite Control to get things exactly the way you want. Now let me give you another example using the Focusrite Control Software with the Headphone Jack 2. Let's say you have a singer or a guitarist that wants to hear themselves while they're recording with no latency. So in this case, we want to monitor the guitar. So I don't want to mute these channels. I want to monitor the bass because maybe there's a bass player playing along with them. We definitely want to hear their condenser mic or their regular mic depending on which one they're singing on. So all of these are going to remain unmuted. Maybe I don't want to hear that much of the bass, or maybe the singer or songwriter doesn't want to hear that much of the bass. Maybe they just want to hear a little bit of the main output coming out of the DAW if they're recording or something like that. And maybe let's have a click track that we want them to hear as well. So I'm going to turn the, actually we'll just leave the click track on the main output. So what they're going to hear is whatever's playing as the track right now. They'll hear the metronome click also in their headphones as well. This is on headphone output 2. They'll hear a little bit of a bass coming in if there's a dry signal coming from a bass. They'll hear themselves on the condenser or regular mic, whichever one they're recording at the time. Nothing from a cue because we're not going to really use that, so we can mute that right now. So I'm going to grab my guitar here again and just play a chord. So that is actually what's being played on Headphone Jack 2 right now. The guitar is coming through. And if I grab the microphone at the same time, so you see the guitar signals coming through and the regular mic at the same time. So back in Ableton, to set that up, so audio track 1 and 2 are armed. If you want to arm 2 tracks at once, you can hold down the control key and click on both at the same time. If I turn on the record option for both of these clip slots, now I will record the guitar and the dynamic mic at the same time. So I've got my metronome actually turned on for 2 bars, only enable when recording, and basically just switch it on. So I'm going to turn the metronome on, and here we go. So I'm just going to click both these clip slots. So they are set up for recording. Now granted, I'm not really recording anything. I'll strum the guitar and show you that there's a signal coming in. So as you see, that is going through. You're not hearing anything out of the speakers right now other than the click, because that's coming out of the main output. If I turn the dynamic mic on, go to that track, as you can see, I am recording on the dynamic mic also as well. So both of those are recording at the same time, audio input from the guitar plus the microphone. If we look back in the Focusrite Control Software, you can see that Headphone Jack 2 is getting the click, so they hear the click, so they can keep up with the tempo and the beat. They also can hear the guitar as well as the regular microphone. I'm talking into the actual microphone right now, and now I'm going to hit a couple of strings on the actual guitar. So all of that is going out of Headphone Jack 2. Microphone, guitar, and the click. They're not hearing anything else. So I'm going to go back into Ableton Live and turn all of that off. Now I'm going to show you one more setup, and this is how you can take advantage of the SPDIF outputs. Now most people are probably going to use just the analog inputs, but you can use the SPDIF output an input for Loopback. Now, some sound cards have software Loopback built into the actual interface. And what that allows you to do is actually take audio, for instance, like coming out of Windows, let's say YouTube, for example. You can actually take the audio from the output of Windows and record it through the Focusrite Control Software or through the actual audio interface software into your DAW. Well, the Focusrite Scarlett interfaces don't have software loopback, but you can recreate that using hardware loopback. So the way this is going to work, so audio is going to come from out of Windows into the Focusrite Control Software out of your main speakers. So that's the signal path, out of Windows into the control, out of the speakers. What I could do is also take that signal and pipe it into the SPDIF output as well. So it's going out of Windows, into control, out of the SPDIF output. That's what the signal path is going to be. Now, it's going to come back into the DAW or into the interface. And you can do this by simply taking an SPDIF cable. So one cable is going to loop from the output on the back of your interface to the input on the back of the interface. So we're going to send that signal out of the output and then right back into the input. Now, normally you would want to be able to hear your hardware inputs as it's coming back into the system. But in this case, we don't, because what's going to happen is the signal's already going out of your main output speakers. You're going to bring that same signal back into the actual interface. If you do that, let's say I add SPDIF here. If I do that and I have that unmuted and actually so I can hear it, it's going to start repeating over top of itself. And it's going to keep doing this endless circle, basically, of bringing this audio in, out of the speakers, and back on top, because I'm trying to listen to it at the same time. So that's what they call a feedback loop. You don't want that to happen, so don't add it in as a hardware input so you can monitor it. Also, in your DAW, you want to make sure you have monitoring turned off there as well whenever you do this. So to set this up, I'm just going to have one audio track. I'm going to delete all these others out of here. We're just going to have one audio track. I want audio from my SPDIF, which is actually input 9 and 10. I want the monitoring to be off, and it's going to actually go to the master. So it's going to record on the master channel, but I don't want to actually hear it out of the master channel because, again, we don't want the feedback loop to occur. So it's just going to record this as a blank track. So I'm going to hit this to turn this to record arm it, and I'm actually going to open up a YouTube video here and play this. This is Learning with Mark Warren. So right now I'm hearing that out of my speakers. If I go into live, you can see there is a signal coming in. So if I clip arm and record this, I'm going to start this over. I've always worked with my... Hello, this is Learning with Mark Warren. And today we're going to talk about... So now the actual signal's recording in. So this is what's happening in Focusrite Control. It's seeing or actually taking the output from our main and putting it to the output of the SPDIF also as well. And live, there's the signal that's actually being recorded. If we double click on this, we can see that's being recorded live. So I'm recording audio directly from YouTube into my DAW. Portraits were taken very quickly, and they didn't require any elaborate setup. So if I come in here and stop this now, just natural lighting. Let me stop this video playing in the background as well. And then we go back into live. Now when we unarm the track and play it back. A few self-portraits. I've always worked with my... Hello. So I stopped it. That's where I rewind it. And today we're going to talk about taking creative portraits anywhere. So that's using basically the hardware loopback option to actually take audio from your Windows system, pipe it back into your computer so you can record it into your DAW. We're just using inputs 9 and 10. Again, we don't want to monitor when we do this because, again, you'll end up with feedback loops. So be careful if you do set that up. Make sure your volume and your speakers are turned down. If you ever did accidentally turn on those monitoring sources, and I'm sure once you hear all that squealing from your speakers, you'll want to turn them off immediately. I hope you've enjoyed this video on how to set up and use the Focusrite Control Software. Hopefully this makes a little more sense to you. If you like this video and want to see more videos like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you can keep up with our latest video postings. This is Learning with Mark Warren, and we'll catch you on the next one.